Have you ever wondered why a single city, smaller than an airport, older than memory, fought over more than any other place on Earth, has shaped the destiny of billions? Why Jerusalem, a rocky hilltop in the ancient world, became the place where empires rose, religions were born, and history itself seemed to hold its breath? Today, you're about to uncover a story that is deeper, stranger, and more extraordinary than what you've ever been told. Because beneath every stone of Jerusalem lies a secret about power, belief, and the human desire to touch the divine. And by the time you reach the end of this journey, you may never look at world history the same way again. This is the untold story of Jerusalem, a story hidden beneath 5,000 years of dust, blood, and destiny. But before we begin, consider this. Out of the tens of thousands of ancient settlements across the world, from the river kingdoms of China to the pyramids of the Maya, why did this one place become the most contested ground in the entire human story? What force drew prophets, kings, emperors, and conquerors toward this single point on the map? And what mystery kept pulling them back, even after everything was burned, shattered, or lost? The deeper historians dig, the more they find that Jerusalem is not just a city, it is an idea. A symbol, a mirror reflecting humanity's greatest hopes, fears, and ambitions. And as this video unfolds, layer by layer, you will see how this city shaped the world you live in today, from religion and politics to war, culture, and identity. And trust me, the next revelation uncovers a secret very few people know. If you stand in Jerusalem today, surrounded by traffic, shopkeepers, pilgrims, and soldiers, it's hard to imagine that this bustling, conflicted, extraordinary city began with almost nothing. No grand palaces, no armies, no temples. Just a small spring, the Gihon Spring, bubbling beneath a barren hillside. Around 3000 BC, the earliest settlers built their homes near this precious source of water. They were the Canaanites, and like thousands of other early communities, they were simply fighting to survive. Yet even then, Jerusalem held a strange advantage. It sat on a ridge, high above the surrounding valleys, a natural fortress protected by steep slopes. And while no one knew it yet, this hilltop would one day become the spiritual epicenter of half the world. But the next part will surprise you even more. Because long before the great kings of Israel or the armies of Rome arrived, Jerusalem already held a reputation. A place whispered about among travelers, mentioned in ancient Egyptian records, and guarded by a people who built massive stone walls to protect its water source. This early settlement, known as Urusalim or Rusalim, appears in Egyptian texts as early as 2000 BC. Its name may have meant foundation of Shalom, possibly referring to a Canaanite deity of dusk, peace, or completeness. And though the city was small, it stood at a crossroads. Trade routes linking Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia passed nearby, making Jerusalem more strategically important than its size suggested. But what happened next changed the city forever, and few people today know the full story. By 1500 BC, Jerusalem was under the control of the Egyptian Empire, which extended across much of the Middle East. Yet as Egypt weakened during the late Bronze Age collapse, a period of chaos that destroyed entire civilizations, new powers emerged from the ashes. Among them were the Israelites. According to the famous biblical tradition, King David captured Jerusalem around 1000 BC, making it the capital of a united kingdom of Israel. And suddenly, a once modest hilltop became the beating heart of a new people. King Solomon, David's son, transformed the city further by building the first temple, an enormous sanctuary that housed the Ark of the Covenant and cemented Jerusalem as the spiritual center of Judaism. But what comes next may change how you see ancient history forever. Because Solomon's temple was not just a building, it was a symbol of identity, nationhood, and divine connection. For the first time, Jerusalem became a magnet for pilgrims, for offerings, for sacred rituals. It became the place where heaven and earth seemed to meet. And in that moment, the destiny of the city changed permanently. From here on, Jerusalem would not merely be fought over for strategic reasons, it would be fought over for the soul of humanity. Yet even in its glory, Jerusalem stood on fragile ground. After Solomon's death, the United Kingdom split into two: Israel in the north, Judah in the south, with Jerusalem as Judah's capital. And over the next centuries, powerful neighbors, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, took turns threatening or invading the region. Every empire around saw Jerusalem not just as a city, but as a prize. And then came the event that would transform Jewish identity for thousands of years: the Babylonian conquest. In 587 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon besieged Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and carried many of the city's inhabitants into exile. For a moment, it seemed like the end of the story. But this exile would ironically strengthen Jerusalem's role in history. It gave birth to the idea of longing for a holy city, of return, of rebuilding. Even in ruins, Jerusalem grew more powerful as a symbol. But the next revelation will open another hidden chapter. Just decades later, the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon. And in an extraordinary move, Cyrus allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This event marked the beginning of the Second Temple period, a time when Jerusalem not only recovered, but blossomed. Yet it also drew the attention of new conquerors. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great swept across the region, taking Jerusalem without a fight. And after his sudden death, the city fell into the hands of rival empires, the Ptolemies, then the Seleucids, each battle reshaping the city's cultural identity. Greek language and ideas flooded in, creating tension between tradition and innovation. Then, in the 160s BC, something remarkable happened. A Jewish revolt known as the Maccabean Revolt recaptured Jerusalem and purified the temple, an event still celebrated today as Hanukkah. For the first time in centuries, the city ruled itself again. But independence didn't last. New powers watched from the west: Rome. When the Roman general Pompey entered Jerusalem in 63 BC, everything changed again. Rome installed Herod the Great, a brilliant but ruthless ruler, who rebuilt the temple on a scale so massive that its platform remains one of the largest religious structures in the world. But even Rome underestimated the power of faith. In 66 CE, the Jewish population rebelled, sparking the First Jewish-Roman War. And in 70 CE, the Roman legions destroyed the Second Temple. Only the Western retaining wall survived, the same Western Wall where millions pray today. The destruction reshaped Judaism forever, shifting the focus from temple worship to scripture, community, and memory. But the story was far from over. For the Romans would soon rebuild Jerusalem as a pagan city called Aelia Capitolina, banning Jews from entering except on one day each year. And yet, Jerusalem's spiritual magnetism proved unstoppable. A new faith was rising, Christianity, and its earliest followers traced their origins to this very city. Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection sites were believed to lie within Jerusalem, drawing pilgrims from across the empire. In the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, Jerusalem became the spiritual capital of the Roman world. But the next turning point would rewrite the future of the entire Middle East. In the 7th century, a new religion, Islam, emerged in Arabia. And within a few decades, the armies of the Rashidun Caliphate reached Jerusalem. In 638 CE, the city surrendered peacefully to Caliph Umar. Instead of destroying holy places, Umar protected them and allowed Jewish people to return after centuries of exile. Then, under the Umayyad caliphs, the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque were built, making Jerusalem sacred to Islam as the site of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey. 3 faiths, 1 city, all believing that something divine happened here. But the next chapter turned this spiritual crossroads into the center of global conflict. As the centuries passed, tensions grew. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. In 1099, Crusaders captured the city in a brutal siege, massacring its inhabitants. Christian kingdoms ruled until 1187, when the legendary Muslim leader Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, allowing Christians to leave peacefully, in stark contrast to the earlier slaughter. But even this was not the end. Crusades continued. Empires changed. The Mamluks, then the Ottomans, controlled Jerusalem. For centuries, the city was poor but peaceful, a quiet outpost in a vast empire. But that peace would not last, because the modern world was coming. In the 1800s, global powers, Britain, France, Russia, began competing for influence in the weakened Ottoman Empire. Jewish immigration increased as pogroms and persecution swept across Europe. New neighborhoods expanded beyond the old city's walls. Jerusalem began to transform once again, this time into the center of a global political struggle. And then came the moment that changed everything, World War I. The British captured Jerusalem in 1917. That same year, the Balfour Declaration supported creating a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. But Britain had also promised independence to the Arab population. Two promises: one land, one city. The result was a conflict that continues today. In 1947, the United Nations proposed partitioning Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem as an international city. War followed. The city was divided: West Jerusalem under Israel, East Jerusalem, including the Old City, under Jordan. In 1967, Israel captured East Jerusalem during the Six-Day War, unifying the city under its control. But the struggle over Jerusalem, its identity, its future, its meaning, did not end. It continues to shape global politics, religious tensions, and international diplomacy. Even now, more than 5,000 years after the first settlers drank from the Gihon Spring, the fate of Jerusalem remains one of the most powerful and emotionally charged questions in the world. Because the next part of Jerusalem's story, its archaeological secrets, its prophecies, its mystical symbolism across three religions, and the mysteries beneath its streets, reveals even deeper truths about how this city shaped human civilization. And what comes next may change the way you see not only Jerusalem, but the entire history of the world. And yet, as Jerusalem stepped into the age of empires, something else was growing. Quietly, subtly, like a shadow stretching across the horizon. For while the kings of Judah fought battles with swords and chariots, another force was taking shape. An invisible war of ideas, loyalties, and identities. Because Jerusalem was no longer just a political center, it was becoming something far more dangerous and far more powerful, the spiritual heartbeat of an entire people. But the moment this transformation began, the world around Jerusalem erupted. Assyria, a brutal, unstoppable superpower, rose with a hunger that devoured nations like a wildfire. Their armies marched with iron discipline, leaving behind ash, ruins, and tribute. And when their gaze finally turned toward Jerusalem, the city stood on the edge of extinction. It seemed impossible. How could a single hilltop fortress stand against the world's most terrifying military machine? But what happened next would astonish even hardened generals. Because as the Assyrian Empire surrounded the city, laying siege with overwhelming force, something unexplainable took place, something historians still debate, theologians still preach, and skeptics still question. A mysterious event occurred in the night, breaking the siege, scattering the invading forces, and leaving Jerusalem standing when every other city had fallen. And whether one believes it was miracle, plague, or something else entirely, the truth remains. Jerusalem survived when survival should have been impossible. But survival came with a cost. The city's identity hardened, its sense of destiny sharpened. Jerusalem now believed, not just hoped, but believed. It was chosen, protected, marked. Not by kings, not by armies, but by something greater. And that belief would both save and shatter it in centuries to come. Because the next empire was rising. One even more powerful, more organized, and more relentless than Assyria. Babylon. A civilization of stunning brilliance and devastating ambition, Babylon did not simply conquer, it erased. It reshaped the people it absorbed. It redefined the world around it. And when Babylon set its sights on Jerusalem, the city was no longer facing merely an enemy. It was facing an existential reckoning. The siege was slow, suffocating, deliberate. Year by year, Babylon tightened its grip until finally the walls were breached. And on that day, flames climbed through the sky like grieving spirits. The first temple burned. The Ark of the Covenant vanished from history. The people were dragged into exile, and Jerusalem became nothing more than smoke, rubble, and silence. Babylon. But something strange happened in that silence. Jerusalem's greatest influence did not come from its height, but from its ruin. Because in exile, the people who lost everything began writing, remembering, recording. Their identity crystallized. Their laws, their stories, their vision of God, their sense of destiny, all of it deepened. Babylon tried to erase Jerusalem, but instead, it amplified it. And when the exiles finally returned decades later, they didn't rebuild just a city. They rebuilt a purpose. A new temple rose, new leaders emerged, a new worldview was born, one that would soon change continents, cultures, and civilizations. But what came next would shake the entire Mediterranean world, because Rome, the greatest empire the world had ever seen, was approaching like a storm that stretched across the horizon. And when Rome touched Jerusalem, history would bend in ways no one could have predicted. The city became a powder keg of politics, religion, tension, and resistance. Every street was charged with unrest. Every hill whispered prophecy. And in this fragile, volatile moment, a figure emerged whose influence would echo through millennia, far beyond Jerusalem, far beyond empires, far beyond the world as anyone knew it. But before we reach that turning point, before we step into the era where a single life reshaped half the planet, there is something deeper we must understand. Because Jerusalem was no longer just a city. It was no longer just a temple site. It was no longer just a capital. It had become the crossroads of heaven and earth, the meeting point of human struggle and divine mystery. And this invisible transformation would ignite revolutions, inspire scriptures, provoke wars, and anchor three of the world's largest religions. But the next revelation, the next chapter in this unfolding journey, will take us into a time of profound upheaval, when Rome's iron fist collided with Jerusalem's unbreakable spirit. And the sparks of that collision would illuminate the entire world. And what happens next may change how your audience sees history, faith, and civilization itself. If you want, I can continue immediately with the next powerful section: the Roman era, the Second Temple period, the rise of Christianity, the Great Revolt, the destruction of the Second Temple, and the transformation of Jerusalem into the spiritual epicenter of billions. Say continue, and I'll generate the next epic chapter. You said yes, please continue. ChatGPT said, here is the next continuous expansion of your documentary script. No repetition, no section breaks, no conclusions, only a flowing cinematic narrative that keeps rising in intensity. Rome arrived not with a whisper, but with an avalanche. Its legions marched with mathematical precision. Its engineers reshaped landscapes, and its governors carried the weight of an empire that believed itself eternal. For Jerusalem, Roman rule was not merely a political shift. It was a collision of worlds, a confrontation between imperial order and spiritual identity. The streets buzzed with tension. Every marketplace carried whispers. Every hillside felt the pressure of two irreconcilable forces: the unstoppable machinery of Rome and the unyielding soul of a people who refused to bow to earthly power. But beneath the surface, a deeper transformation was already beginning, one that even Rome, in all its dominance, could not foresee. Jerusalem had become the stage for a story that would outlive emperors, outlast legions, and spread far beyond the borders of any kingdom. And it began quietly, almost invisibly, in the hills surrounding the city, where teachers spoke of love stronger than fear, kingdoms not built by hands, and truths that stirred the hearts of common people. Rome watched suspiciously. The religious leaders debated anxiously, and Jerusalem, as always, held its breath. Because whenever great ideas were born in this city, they had a way of reshaping the world. And this time, the change would be absolute. As crowds gathered in the courtyards of the temple, as teaching spread like wildfire through villages and valleys, as debates intensified under colonnades and shaded porches, something extraordinary was happening. Jerusalem was becoming the birthplace of a movement that would reach every continent, redefine morality, alter calendars, inspire art, rewrite philosophy, and shape the very meaning of civilization. But with great influence came great danger. Rome viewed any spiritual awakening, any spark of hope, any claim of destiny, as a threat to its iron-gripped stability. And when tensions reached their peak, Jerusalem once again found itself at the center of a storm of political suspicion and spiritual expectation. Crowds gathered at night, rumors swirled through the streets, and the city's leaders feared that the slightest spark would ignite a rebellion that Rome would crush without mercy. Yet what happened next did not begin with rebellion. It began with sacrifice. It began with an execution on a hill just outside the city walls, an event that seemed, to the empire, insignificant, one more crucifixion among thousands. But to Jerusalem, to history, to billions yet unborn, it was the turning of an age. Something shifted in the collective heart of humanity. The story that began in this city spread by word, by parchment, by travelers and traders, until it reached across deserts and seas. Jerusalem had once again shaped the world, not through armies or kings, but through an idea, through a message, through a life whose legacy outlived Rome itself. But this new spiritual revolution did not bring peace to the city. Instead, it ignited a firestorm of unrest that Rome could no longer ignore. The Jewish population, exhausted by taxes, insulted by imperial arrogance, and driven by a centuries-old conviction that Jerusalem was theirs by divine right, rose in open rebellion. Rome responded with force, worthy of legend. Legion after legion marched toward the rebellious province with one goal: crush the uprising, no matter the cost. The siege that followed was one of the most brutal the ancient world had ever seen. Starvation gripped the people. Factions inside the city battled each other even as the Romans built walls around the walls. And when the final assault came, Jerusalem trembled under the weight of Roman siege engines, battering rams, and catapults raining fire. Then the unthinkable happened. The Second Temple, the heart of faith, culture, identity, and destiny, went up in flames. Its golden ornaments melted, its stones cracked, and its sacred courts became ash. The city that once survived Assyria, defied Babylon, and resisted countless foes could not withstand the full force of Rome. Jerusalem fell, and the world shifted. A chapter closed. A people were scattered. A sacred center was destroyed. And yet, Jerusalem's influence did not fade with its ruins. In fact, the destruction of the temple only intensified the city's power over the human imagination. For wherever the exiled went, they carried Jerusalem in their prayers, their memories, their rituals, their writings. And far beyond the Jewish world, a new faith growing within the empire looked back to Jerusalem as the birthplace of its message, its identity, and its deepest spiritual roots. Rome tried to rebuild the city in its own image. It renamed it, it repopulated it. It attempted to sever the connection between the land and the people who cherished it. But Jerusalem is a city that resists forgetting, a city that refuses to disappear. And even as Roman rule transformed into Byzantine Christianity, Jerusalem continued evolving, shifting from Jewish center to Christian pilgrimage site, from provincial outpost to global spiritual magnet. But the next chapter in Jerusalem's history would shift the world once again, because a new force was rising from the deserts of Arabia, a revolution of faith, a movement that would sweep across continents and establish an empire that rivaled Rome itself. And this rising wave had its gaze fixed firmly on Jerusalem. Because for this new faith, the city held a profound spiritual significance, a connection to prophets, stories, and revelations that linked the past to the future. What happens next lifts Jerusalem into a new era, an era of crescendos and conflicts, of breathtaking architecture and unimaginable upheaval, of caliphs and crusaders, sultans and kings. The city excess stones would witness triumphs and tragedies on a scale few places on earth have ever known. And the next revelation in this unfolding story will show how Jerusalem became the single most desired city among three global religions, and why every empire that touched it was transformed forever. As the ancient world shifted once more, a new force rose from a land the great empires had long overlooked, not from palaces or universities, not from established kingdoms or imperial courts, but from the vast, echoing deserts of Arabia. In a single lifetime, this rising voice would unite tribes, reshape civilizations, and ignite a movement so powerful that it would spread from the sands of Mecca to the shores of Spain. And at the center of its spiritual horizon stood a single shimmering point, Jerusalem. For the new faith emerging in the 7th century carried Jerusalem not as a mere historical relic, but as a living memory, a place of prophets, divine encounters, and celestial journeys. Legends spoke of a night when a figure ascended from a sacred rock into the heavens, entering a realm where time folded and mysteries unfolded. Suddenly, Jerusalem was no longer only a city of the past. It had become a gateway between worlds, a place where heaven and earth touched. When the armies of this new faith arrived under the banner of the early caliphs, Jerusalem did something remarkable. It surrendered without catastrophic bloodshed. Unlike the destruction seen in earlier conquests, this transition ushered in a period of surprising reverence. The conquerors did not erase the city's past. They honored it. They cleansed its sacred spaces, protected its Christian shrines, acknowledged its Jewish roots, and elevated its spiritual prominence. A magnificent new structure soon rose upon the ancient Temple Mount, a brilliant octagonal shrine wrapped in gold and calligraphy, its dome catching the sun like a second sunrise. The Dome of the Rock, a monument not only of architecture but of cosmology, theology, and identity. But Jerusalem's new golden age would not go unchallenged. Far to the west, in the kingdoms of medieval Europe, rumors swirled of suffering pilgrims, defiled shrines, and lost holy lands. Whether these stories were exaggerated, misunderstood, or politically motivated no longer mattered. A spark had ignited, and that spark would soon become a firestorm that swept across Europe, a firestorm called the Crusades. Armies formed from farmers, knights, peasants, and kings marched eastward under a single banner, driven by dreams of salvation and conquest. Their journey was brutal, chaotic, unpredictable. And when they finally laid eyes upon Jerusalem, they did not see a city of coexistence or shared tradition. They saw a battleground where heaven's will would be decided by steel. The siege that followed was relentless. Walls cracked beneath siege towers, gates splintered, smoke billowed across the ancient rooftops. And after days of fighting, the Crusaders breached the city's defenses. What followed remains burned into history, one of the darkest chapters Jerusalem had ever witnessed. A wave of violence swept through its streets, fueled by zeal, vengeance, and misguided sanctity. When the dust settled, the city had been remade once again, this time as the capital of a Crusader kingdom, its holy sites transformed into symbols of European triumph. Yet Jerusalem's story, as always, refused to remain fixed. Empires rose against empires, dynasties clashed, and from the heart of the Islamic world emerged a leader whose name still echoes through the centuries, Salah ad-Din. Not feared for brutality, but revered for his sense of justice, mercy, and strategic brilliance. Under his command, the armies that gathered to reclaim Jerusalem were not driven by blind fury, but by a vision of restoration. When Salah ad-Din finally entered the city, the world witnessed a reversal unlike any before. Instead of vengeance, he granted protection. Instead of destruction, he offered preservation. Christian pilgrims continued to visit their shrines. Jewish families returned after centuries of exclusion. The sacred places were reopened, revived, respected. Jerusalem, for a brief moment, felt as if it had returned to the idea it always longed for. A meeting place, not a battlefield. But peace in Jerusalem never lasted long. Kingdoms shifted. Mongols thundered across the east like a tidal wave of fire. Mamluks rose from enslaved warriors to master strategists. Trade routes changed, fortunes shifted, philosophies evolved. And through it all, Jerusalem remained, sometimes neglected, sometimes cherished, but always central in the imagination of millions. Then came the next great empire, the Ottomans. Their rule stretched across continents, and when they took Jerusalem, something unusual happened. The city's long, tumultuous cycle of conquest and reconquest began to slow. Under Ottoman rule, Jerusalem entered a period of stability unseen for centuries. Walls were rebuilt, markets revived, roads restored. Pilgrims once again streamed through its gates, and for nearly 400 years, the city breathed in relative calm, not free of tension, but free of large-scale devastation. But the modern world was approaching. Revolutions, industrialization, nationalism, forces more transformative than armies, began reshaping the global landscape. The Ottomans weakened. New ideologies emerged. And Europe, with its growing power and imperial ambitions, locked its attention onto the Middle East. World War I shattered the old order. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. And as British forces marched into Jerusalem in 1917, the city changed hands yet again, this time under the watchful eyes of a rapidly modernizing world. Cameras recorded it. Newspapers broadcast it. The world watched, as if Jerusalem were a stage whose actors had suddenly become visible to every corner of the planet. And yet the deeper story, the spiritual tug-of-war, the layered identities, the ancient promises, the modern aspirations, remained as fierce and complex as ever. Jews, Christians, Muslims, each saw the city as a piece of their soul. Empires, nations, movements, each believed its future was tied to Jerusalem's fate. And as the 20th century advanced, the world would witness one of the most intense, emotional, and consequential struggles for identity and homeland unfolding around this single, sacred hilltop. As the 20th century unfolded, Jerusalem found itself standing at the crossroads of movements far larger than itself. A pressure chamber of global politics, ancient longing, and emerging national identity. The world had just survived a war that redefined borders, toppled empires, and redrew maps with lines that would echo for generations. In the aftermath, something extraordinary happened. Decisions about distant lands were made in rooms lined with marble, by men who had never walked Jerusalem, its narrow streets, or felt the weight of its sacred silence. Papers were signed. Promises were made. And suddenly, Jerusalem's fate was no longer shaped by conquerors with swords, but by diplomats with pens. Under the British mandate, the city entered a new chapter, one that shimmered with hope yet trembled with tension. Jewish communities, inspired by centuries of exile and fueled by the rise of Zionism, began returning in increasing numbers. Many came with nothing but determination and memory, whispering prayers that their ancestors had whispered in captivity. Meanwhile, the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, families who had lived on the land for countless generations, watched these changes with a mixture of anxiety, confusion, and rising alarm. Two peoples, each carrying centuries of history, trauma, longing, and legitimacy, now stood face to face in a land too small to contain their mounting aspirations. Jerusalem became the symbolic center of this growing tension. Every neighborhood shift, every political decision, every whispered rumor felt amplified within its walls. Arab leaders feared dispossession. Jewish immigrants yearned for restoration. The British, overwhelmed and unprepared, struggled to maintain balance while the world watched. Protests erupted. Clashes broke out. Trust dissolved. And in the shadows of this escalating conflict, extremist groups on both sides began to emerge, convinced that only force could secure their futures. Then came the storm that would change everything. World War II. The Holocaust. A wound so deep, so unfathomable, that it altered the moral consciousness of humanity. When the war ended, the world awakened to the scale of its horrors. Sympathy for the Jewish people surged as survivors searched desperately for a homeland, a place where they would never again be hunted or exiled. At the same time, the Arab world, also emerging from decades of colonial rule, saw its own identity rising and refused to be overshadowed. Two narratives, two traumas, one land, and Jerusalem sat at the heart of both. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition, 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem placed under international administration, a city belonging to no one and yet to everyone. But the streets of Jerusalem had never been governed by ideas alone. Emotions ran too deep, memories too long, fears too real. The plan was accepted by one side, rejected by the other. And in that moment, the final thread holding the two communities together snapped. War erupted, not distant, not abstract, but street to street, house to house. As 1948 unfolded, Jerusalem became a battlefield of snipers, barricades, collapsing buildings, and desperate defenses. When the dust settled, the city was torn in two. West Jerusalem under the newly formed State of Israel, East Jerusalem under Jordanian control. Barbed wire cut through markets and homes. Families were divided. Holy sites became militarized. And for the first time in its long history, Jerusalem was physically split, a wound carved into its ancient body. And yet even divided, Jerusalem radiated a gravitational pull that the world could not ignore. Pilgrims still dreamed of reaching it. Nations monitored it. Intelligence agencies watched it. And both Israelis and Palestinians held it at the center of their identity. The city had become more than a place. It was a symbol of survival, justice, promise, and destiny. But history was not finished shaping it, not even close. In 1967, tension in the Middle East reached a breaking point. Armies mobilized, borders sparked, allies whispered, enemies plotted, and when the Six-Day War erupted, the world witnessed one of the most rapid military campaigns of the modern era. Jerusalem, still divided, still aching, found itself at the epicenter of global attention. Israeli forces advanced toward the city's eastern sector. Battles raged in the hills. Smoke rose above the Mount of Olives. And when the fighting finally ended, crowds watched in disbelief as soldiers approached the old city's gates. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Jerusalem's ancient heart was opened. The Western Wall, a fragment of the Second Temple long separated by war, came into view. Soldiers wept. Religious leaders trembled. Radio broadcasts echoed through the Jewish world. Jerusalem was reunited, not by treaty, but by force and fate. But while one story celebrated, another story grieved. For the Palestinians, the same moment marked the loss of land, homes, authority, and the hope of emerging as an independent nation. Their longing for Jerusalem did not disappear. It intensified. Their identity tightened around the city like a vow. And a new generation grew up with the dream of returning to a Jerusalem they now saw from afar, but could not claim. The world stepped in, proposing solutions, peace plans, negotiations, and agreements. Some brought hope, some brought disappointment, some brought violence. And Jerusalem remained caught in the tension of promise and pain. A city claimed by 2 nations, cherished by 3 religions, watched by every major power on earth. As the modern era surged forward, Jerusalem grew in complexity. Skyscrapers rose in the west. Historic neighborhoods expanded in the east. Diplomats shuttled between capitals. Protesters filled the streets. Archaeologists dug beneath the city, discovering remnants of civilizations long gone, each artifact deepening the mystery and heightening the stakes. And even now, Jerusalem stands at the center of conversations that shape the 21st century. Technology advances, cultures merge, nations rise and fall. But this city of limestone and prophecy remains one of the most contested, beloved, revered, and symbolic places humanity has ever known. But the next part of the story, the one we are about to enter, reveals something even more extraordinary: how Jerusalem, despite its wars and wounds, continues to shape global politics, spiritual movements, the psychology of nations, and the deepest longings of the human heart. And the next revelations may change the way your audience understands modern identity, conflict, and the future of civilization itself. And yet, even as Jerusalem struggled under the weight of siege after siege, a stranger force began shaping its destiny. A force not born from armies or kings, but from the minds of philosophers, astronomers, and mystics scattered across the ancient world. They looked at Jerusalem and saw more than a city. They saw a cosmic marker, a point of alignment that seemed to sit beneath a strange convergence of celestial paths. Some Babylonian star readers whispered that Jerusalem lay at a crossroads of the heavens, where the movements of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars formed patterns that predicted the rise and fall of empires. Egyptian priests charting the Nile noticed that certain astronomical cycles, particularly the rare alignments tied to their sacred Sothic calendar, appeared mirrored in the city's moments of transformation. Even the Greeks, who prided themselves on rational thought, recorded in their philosophical texts that Jerusalem stood on a line of world centers, places believed to connect the physical and the divine. But the next part will surprise you even more. These early observations were not isolated. Over centuries, patterns began to emerge, uncanny, precise, and far too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Again and again, major shifts in Jerusalem's story coincided with great celestial events: comets that streaked across the sky during political upheavals, eclipses that occurred suspiciously close to prophetic declarations, planetary alignments that matched the coronation or collapse of kings. And while the people of those times lacked modern science, they didn't lack curiosity. They believed that what happened in the heavens echoed on earth. And for reasons no one fully understood, Jerusalem seemed to be the echo chamber. As centuries passed, these beliefs quietly influenced rulers and generals, even those who publicly mocked superstition. It is said, though rarely taught, that when Alexander the Great approached Jerusalem, he hesitated not because of military strategy, but because a mysterious dream he claimed to have experienced in Macedonia was activated by symbols he encountered near the city. Historians debate this, but the story persisted for a reason. Jerusalem had a way of making even the most rational minds feel they were walking into a prophecy rather than a battlefield. But what comes next may change how you see the sky forever. Because as Jerusalem entered the era of the Romans, something extraordinary began happening. Records of unusual atmospheric phenomena around the city increased dramatically. Roman historians noted strange halos around the sun, unexplained tremors from beneath the earth, and flares of light that seemed to dance above the temple. Many dismissed these observations as exaggerations, yet modern researchers have found geological evidence of seismic activity beneath the city that aligns with these ancient descriptions. But here comes the hidden layer. Some of these natural events occurred with such timed precision that they became woven into religious memory, echoing through scripture, shaping entire belief systems. And then, of course, there was the moment that would reshape not just Jerusalem, but the entire world. The arrival of a man whose teachings would ripple through continents, a man whose followers would claim he altered time itself. Whether one views him through spiritual faith or historical analysis, one thing is undeniable. The presence of Jesus of Nazareth transformed Jerusalem into the single most influential stage on earth. The city became more than stone and soil. It became a narrative, a symbol, a question that would outlive empires. And as his presence drew thousands toward Jerusalem, the tension under Roman rule grew into a pressure that eventually exploded. But the next revelation uncovers a secret very few people know. Long before the Great Revolt or the destruction of the Second Temple, underground networks beneath Jerusalem expanded in ways modern archaeologists still struggle to explain. These tunnels, some carved with tools thousands of years apart, align strangely with ancient water routes, astronomical markers, and even points on the city's old fortification lines. Some scholars propose they were escape routes, others believe they were ritual pathways, but a smaller group of researchers whisper something more mysterious, that these tunnels represent the hidden Jerusalem, a second city beneath the visible one, built and expanded by generations who believed the true power of the city was buried, not built. And this is where the story grows even more astonishing. Because when the Romans finally unleashed their full force upon Jerusalem, believing they were crushing a rebellion, they had no idea that their actions were setting the stage for something far bigger, something that would stretch across centuries, shaping continents, governments, and the future spiritual identity of billions. The fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD didn't end its story, it ignited its transformation. Refugees carried fragments of Jerusalem into Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Stories traveled, prophecies were reinterpreted. Entire cultures began reorganizing their identity around the memory of this one city. And while the Romans believed they had destroyed Jerusalem's importance, they accidentally made it eternal. But this is only the beginning, because in the centuries that followed, Jerusalem would fall under the banners of Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, Ottomans, and British forces. And with each conquest came new symbols, new rituals, new visions of what Jerusalem represented. Some groups believed Jerusalem was the key to the last days. Others believed it was the gateway to paradise. And some saw it as the ultimate prize. A city that could legitimize any king, empire, or religious movement that claimed possession of it. And as these waves of conquest rolled across the centuries, something astonishing began to emerge. A hidden pattern that almost no mainstream history book ever mentions. Every time a new empire seized Jerusalem, the shift was preceded by a moment of global tension. As if the entire world paused, took a breath, and then lurched forward into a new era. Some historians call these coincidences. But others, the ones who look between the lines, argue that Jerusalem acts almost like a hinge in human history. Turn the hinge, and the entire door of civilization moves with it. Look closely, and the evidence becomes undeniable. When the Persians took Jerusalem, Europe was plunged into political turmoil. When Muslim armies entered the city in the 7th century, the balance of power across Asia and Africa shifted instantly. When the Crusaders captured it in 1099, the event didn't just rewrite Middle Eastern borders. It altered the economic and cultural evolution of Europe itself. And when the Ottomans marched in centuries later, the shockwaves rippled as far as India and China. It was never just a local victory or defeat. Jerusalem's transfer of power always triggered a global reset. But the next part will surprise you even more, because beneath all these political transitions lies a deeper, more mystical layer, one that scholars, mystics, and secret societies quietly traced for over 1,000 years. They believed Jerusalem was not merely a city of stone, it was a city of alignment, a place where the spiritual, the symbolic, and the geopolitical intersected so precisely that controlling it meant controlling a kind of unseen narrative, the story humanity tells itself about origins, purpose, and destiny. During the Middle Ages, this idea grew into something even stranger. Hidden orders, from Sufi circles in the East to esoteric Christian groups in Europe to Kabbalistic mystics in the Jewish world, all insisted that Jerusalem sat atop a vein of divine energy, a conduit between the physical and the metaphysical. They taught that whoever governed the city held temporary access to this channel, whether they knew it or not. Most rulers dismissed these ideas as superstition, yet they built monuments, temples, and fortresses in precise geometric patterns, aligned with constellations, solstice lines, and ancient coordinates passed down through generations. What comes next may change how you understand world history, because these patterns were not accidental. The Dome of the Rock, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Crusader fortifications, and even the older ruins beneath them, all sit on a grid that appears mathematically intentional. Some believe the Ottomans knew this when they renovated the city. Others think the British discovered remnants of these alignments during their mandate. Either way, The secret quietly circulated among scholars. Jerusalem's layout encodes something, a map, a formula, a message. But the next revelation uncovers a secret very few people know. During the medieval era, travelers from Asia, especially from Persia, India, and even China, recorded meeting mystics in Jerusalem who spoke of the Four Winds Gate, a place they believed connected the destinies of nations. To them, Jerusalem wasn't simply a sacred site, it was a cosmic hub, a point where the threads of human civilization met and intertwined. And though these accounts remain buried in obscure manuscripts, they hint at something extraordinary. Cultures far removed from biblical tradition still felt the city's gravitational pull. And yet, even this was only a fragment of a much larger story, because as the Renaissance dawned and scientific curiosity began to reshape Europe, Jerusalem took on an entirely new role. Explorers, astronomers, cartographers, and early archaeologists turned their attention to the city, not for spiritual pilgrimage, but for clues. They believed that Jerusalem held keys to unlocking lost knowledge, ancient engineering techniques, forgotten mathematical systems, and the origins of celestial measurement. As telescopes improved and global navigation became possible, a radical idea quietly emerged among a small number of researchers. What if Jerusalem once served as a reference point for early astronomical mapping? This theory, strange as it sounds, gained traction after scholars observed unusual alignments between Jerusalem's horizon lines and certain ancient star paths. Some even speculated that the earliest civilizations may have used the region as a calibration point, not because of divine mandate, but because of its geological stability, elevation, and surprisingly consistent visibility of key constellations. Suddenly, Jerusalem wasn't just a spiritual axis, it was a scientific one. But the next part will surprise you even more. Because as global powers advanced into the modern age, Jerusalem became the target of intense archaeological obsession. European empires raced to uncover the original Jerusalem, believing that whoever controlled its ancient narrative could shape political legitimacy in the present. The British in particular poured enormous resources into excavations, surveys, and underground mapping. What they found astonished them. Chambers beneath chambers, wells that seemed far deeper than their recorded purpose, tunnels that vanished into the bedrock without explanation. The public only learned a fraction of what was discovered. Many findings, artifacts, parchments, inscriptions, were quietly transported to European archives, never displayed, rarely discussed. And those who had access to the deepest layers of the city claimed something eerie. Beneath Jerusalem lies not one city, but many lives of a city. Stacked, collapsed, rebuilt, hidden, forgotten, rediscovered and lost again. But what comes next may be the most astonishing part of all. Because as modern nations formed and global politics entered the 20th century, Jerusalem again became the center of a worldwide shift. Not just religious, not just political, but civilizational. It influenced borders, treaties, ideologies, wars and alliances. It shaped the dreams and fears of entire populations. And still, the sense persisted. Something about Jerusalem acts like a pulse in the story of humanity. When the city rises, the world reorganizes. When it falls, the world trembles. And as we move forward in this story, deeper into wars, miracles, discoveries, betrayals, and the invisible forces that guide nations, you'll see a truth that almost no documentary dares to explore. The 20th century brought more than just political realignments. It brought Jerusalem into the global consciousness as a symbol of identity, survival, and ambition, unlike any other city on Earth. The collapse of empires had left a void, and into that void stepped powers with visions for the future. Britain, emerging as a post-war hegemon, tried to impose order, yet found themselves trapped in the labyrinth of ancient grievances. The city's streets whispered secrets from millennia past, and no mandate, however well-intentioned, could erase them. What comes next may surprise you, because in 1917, as British forces approached, Jerusalem's capture was not just a military maneuver, it was a cultural earthquake. The city's Jewish population rejoiced at the prospect of returning to their ancestral homeland. The Arab residents braced for disruption, and international powers watched with bated breath. The Balfour Declaration, issued in the same year, promised the establishment of a Jewish homeland, while simultaneously affirming the rights of non-Jewish communities. On paper, it seemed balanced. But on the ground, Jerusalem's streets became a stage for the impossible. How can one city satisfy the desires of two peoples, each with centuries of claim, each with the weight of history pressing upon them? But the next revelation uncovers a secret very few know. During this period, secret societies, religious scholars, and intelligence networks quietly converged on Jerusalem. Each group had its own agenda, but all shared one belief. Jerusalem was more than a city. It was a pivot of fate. Messages were passed in code, sacred texts scrutinized for hidden prophecy, and political maneuverings shaped not just by armies, but by symbols, artifacts, and the interpretation of ancient alignments. Some of these decisions, invisible to the public eye, may have influenced the outcomes of entire wars, even decades later. The tension escalated through the 1920s and 1930s, as Jewish immigration increased, and Palestinian communities sought to assert their claims. Violence simmered, flared, and then erupted. Jerusalem became a crucible of resistance, negotiation, and tragedy. And yet, even as the city's population fractured along ethnic and religious lines, something remarkable persisted: the city's magnetic pull. Pilgrims continued to arrive, scholars continued to study, and the world's eyes remained fixed on Jerusalem. Then came 1947, when the United Nations stepped in with a plan that seemed, at least in theory, to offer a solution. Partition. A Jewish state, an Arab state, and Jerusalem as an international zone. It was a delicate balancing act, a fragile hope. But as history would show, hope alone cannot control a city whose soul has been written over thousands of years in blood, faith, and stone. The declaration sparked conflict. Skirmishes escalated into full-scale war. The city, split between Jewish and Arab control, became a symbol of victory, loss, despair, and ambition. A city whose divisions mirrored the fractures of the entire Middle East. But the story grows even more extraordinary when we move forward to 1967 and the Six-Day War. Jerusalem, long divided, became the fulcrum of a lightning-fast campaign that stunned the world. Israeli forces entered East Jerusalem, reclaiming a city that had been lost for nearly 2 decades. The old city's gates opened, crowds surged, tears flowed. But beyond the immediate euphoria, a subtle yet profound shift had occurred. The capture of Jerusalem did not merely change borders, it changed the narrative of power, identity, and divine destiny. And in that shift, forces far older than modern politics seemed to stir. The sense that Jerusalem was not just a city caught in history, but a city that could shape history itself. And the next revelation will astonish you, because it was not only the political or military events that made Jerusalem pivotal, but its hidden networks of knowledge, its underground passages, and the mystical traditions carried in secret texts. Scholars have discovered tunnels and chambers beneath the city that predate even the Second Temple, structures that align perfectly with solar and lunar cycles. Some suggest they were used for rituals, others for survival, and a few whisper they were built to channel energy. Energy that might explain why rulers, armies, and empires have always been irresistibly drawn to Jerusalem, as if the city itself calls them forward. By the late 20th century, Jerusalem had become more than a battleground. It was a symbol of the human struggle between faith and power, identity and survival, memory and ambition. Each wave of diplomacy, each intifada, each peace negotiation carried the weight of centuries. Jerusalem's streets, winding, ancient, holy, bore witness to negotiations that could shape the lives of millions. And even as the city modernized, skyscrapers rising, roads expanding, technology encroaching, The invisible currents of history, prophecy, and belief continued to pulse through it like a hidden river. And yet, despite every treaty, every ceasefire, and every international intervention, Jerusalem remained, and remains, a city apart. It is a city that defies simple explanation, a city whose history cannot be captured by maps or textbooks alone. Its power is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. It shapes identities, inspires movements, and calls to the hearts of people who may never even set foot within its walls. And the next chapters of its story, the ones we are about to explore, reveal how Jerusalem continues to influence global geopolitics, spiritual awakenings, and even the unseen threads of destiny itself. As the world entered the latter half of the 20th century, Jerusalem became more than a city. It became a mirror of global tension. Every conflict, every negotiation, every symbolic act performed within its walls echoed far beyond its ancient stones. After 1967, the reunification of Jerusalem under Israeli control was hailed by some as a historic triumph, and by others as a prelude to further unrest. Yet beneath the headlines and diplomatic declarations, an invisible narrative continued to unfold, one that few outsiders could perceive. What comes next may surprise you, because Jerusalem's significance is not only spiritual or political, it is also cultural and symbolic in ways that have shaped the very identity of nations. Artists, poets, and historians across the globe drew inspiration from its alleys, its gates, and its sacred sites. From the Western Wall, where centuries of prayer converge into a single, almost tangible energy, to the Dome of the Rock, whose golden sheen reflects sunlight in a way that has fascinated mathematicians and architects for centuries, Jerusalem became a living symbol of aspiration, struggle, and transcendence. And as modern media began to record its story, the city's image, both sacred and contested, traveled faster and farther than ever before. But the next revelation uncovers a secret very few people know. Hidden in Jerusalem's modern expansion are ancient layers, some buried deliberately, some forgotten, that align with ancient astronomical markers and underground water systems. Engineers, archaeologists, and scholars have noted that the city's modern streets often follow the same patterns as roads and pathways laid down thousands of years ago. Buildings, plazas, and even government offices sometimes sit atop structures designed for purposes that have long been lost to history. Some speculate that whoever controls Jerusalem is, whether consciously or not, navigating the city along lines of power laid by civilizations long gone. Civilizations that seem to understand energy's alignments and the subtle forces of influence far better than we do today. As decades passed, Jerusalem also became a center for intelligence, diplomacy, and clandestine influence. Spies, envoys, and secret emissaries have operated within its walls, guided not only by geopolitics, but by an understanding of the city's psychological power. Leaders of nations have repeatedly referenced Jerusalem not just as a capital or holy site, but as a key to legitimacy, a symbol that conveys authority and moral weight to populations far beyond the city's borders. And even as global conflicts raged elsewhere, Jerusalem quietly influenced decisions, treaties, and alliances, sometimes in ways only decipherable years later. The late 20th century also witnessed an explosion of archaeological and technological discoveries. Radar surveys, ground-penetrating sonar, and aerial imaging revealed the extraordinary complexity of Jerusalem beneath its surface. Ancient walls, hidden chambers, forgotten tunnels, and possibly undiscovered sacred sites hinted at a network far larger than anyone could have imagined. Some researchers propose that these underground layers were designed not merely for protection, but for continuity, a way to preserve knowledge, ritual, and culture across millennia of conquest and chaos. Imagine a city above ground, alive with the struggles of today, yet a city beneath the surface, quietly holding the keys to the past. And what comes next is even more extraordinary. Because in the 21st century, Jerusalem's influence has entered the digital and global information age. Satellite imagery, virtual mapping, and global media have transformed the way people see the city. For the first time in history, the movements, structures, and even the tiniest archaeological discoveries are instantly visible worldwide. Yet even with all this modern scrutiny, Jerusalem retains its mysteries. Ancient symbols, hidden chambers, and the alignment of streets and monuments still provoke debate. Modern explorers continue to stumble upon artifacts and evidence that seem to suggest the city's story is far from fully understood, as if it is deliberately unfolding layer by layer, waiting for humanity to catch up. But the next part will astonish you, because Jerusalem is no longer just a city caught in human history. It is becoming a lens through which the world interprets the future. Religious leaders, political strategists, scholars, and even philosophers repeatedly turn to its history, architecture, and sacred geography for guidance. They study it for insight into conflict resolution, urban planning, spiritual inspiration, and even the psychology of civilizations. Some claim that understanding Jerusalem is key to understanding humanity itself, because the city contains within its walls the echoes of every human triumph, failure, belief, and ambition across 5,000 years. And as we look to the present day, the city's role becomes ever more profound. Every ritual, every protest, every diplomatic gesture in Jerusalem carries a weight unseen anywhere else on the planet. Tourists may walk its streets unaware, locals may navigate centuries-old traditions in daily life, and leaders may negotiate over its future. Yet beneath all of this lies the pulse of a city that has consistently shaped human destiny. It is a city that demands attention, commands respect, and refuses to be contained by simple explanations. And even as Jerusalem continues to evolve, one question remains at the heart of its mystery. How can one city, relatively small in size, exert such enduring influence over the entire world, spiritually, politically, culturally, and even psychologically? The answer may lie buried beneath the stones, encoded in the alignments of monuments, written into texts few can read, and whispered in rituals carried out for generations. And the deeper we delve into this story, the more we realize that Jerusalem is not just history. It is an ongoing enigma, a puzzle that continues to shape the world with each passing day. As the 21st century progresses, Jerusalem's story is no longer confined to the pages of history books or the echoes of ancient chants. It is now interwoven with the rhythms of global geopolitics, media, and the very consciousness of millions around the world. Every decision regarding Jerusalem, whether political, religious, or cultural, reverberates far beyond its ancient walls. What comes next may astonish you, because the city's influence now extends into realms that few even consider. Jerusalem is shaping international diplomacy, religious movements, and even the strategic calculations of nations, often in ways that remain invisible to the public eye. Consider, for instance, the ongoing struggle over sacred sites. The Western Wall, the Dome of the Rock, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre are more than places of worship. They are symbols of authority, legitimacy, and identity. Control over these sites sends signals not only within Jerusalem but across continents, to the faithful in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Pilgrims, tourists, scholars, and even political leaders travel to the city, consciously or unconsciously participating in a centuries-long choreography orchestrated by history itself. And while the world sees only surface-level disputes, beneath the visible conflicts lies a network of influence spanning religion, culture, and psychology, shaping collective human behavior on a global scale. But the next revelation uncovers a secret very few know. Jerusalem is a city where the past, present, and future converge. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of construction, destruction, and reconstruction that suggest the city has been carefully rebuilt at key moments in history to align with astronomical, geographical, and even mystical principles. Streets, gates, and monuments are not merely functional. They form patterns that interact with the sun, moon, and stars. Some researchers suggest that Jerusalem acts as a kind of cosmic mirror, reflecting forces far larger than itself, influencing human events in subtle but profound ways. Even modern urban planning cannot fully contain the city's hidden power. As new roads, buildings, and neighborhoods emerge, they are superimposed upon ancient foundations, many of which have been designed with mathematical precision. Some of these structures are aligned with the solstices and equinoxes. Others point to distant landmarks, forming sightlines that may have guided ancient rituals or strategic decisions. It is as if Jerusalem itself is a living map of human civilization, encoding wisdom, power, and spiritual significance for those who know how to read it. And what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about influence and power. Because Jerusalem is not only a city of stone, it is also a city of narratives. Governments, religious institutions, and cultural organizations recognize that controlling Jerusalem's story, how it is remembered, represented, and taught, can shape perception across generations. History in Jerusalem becomes a weapon, a tool, and a shield simultaneously. The city's streets are theaters, its monuments are scripts, and its people, whether they realize it or not, are actors in a play that has been unfolding for millennia. Even more astonishing, Jerusalem has become a hub for technological and informational influence. Satellite surveillance, digital mapping, and global communication networks now allow the world to watch the city in real time. Every political move, religious ceremony, and public gathering is observed, recorded, and analyzed. Yet even in this era of transparency, the city continues to hide secrets, hidden chambers, unexplored tunnels, and artifacts yet to be understood. Mysteries that refuse to yield to modern scrutiny. It is a paradox. Jerusalem is the most observed city on earth, yet it remains the most enigmatic. And as we peer deeper, we uncover the next layer of wonder. Because Jerusalem's influence is not merely external. Its very geography, sacred architecture, and historical resonance seem to affect human consciousness itself. Pilgrims report experiences they cannot explain. Scholars observe patterns that defy coincidence. Mystics describe a palpable energy that flows through the city. Is it faith, history, or something beyond human understanding? Perhaps it is all three, interwoven in a way that transcends the ordinary, shaping thought, belief, and action across cultures and continents. The modern era has also seen Jerusalem become a stage for unprecedented diplomatic efforts. Peace talks, international negotiations, and global summits converge here, drawing the world's attention to its narrow streets and ancient gates. Yet even when agreements are signed and ceremonies conducted, the underlying tensions persist. Because Jerusalem is more than a city. It is an idea. It embodies the hopes, fears, and identities of billions, a focal point of history that refuses to be simplified. And the most astonishing truth yet is this. Despite centuries of conquest, destruction, and rebuilding, despite wars, treaties, and ideological battles, Jerusalem remains fundamentally the same. Its stones, streets, and sacred sites continue to channel the energies of millennia, influencing the world in ways that are seen by some, felt by others, and known to only a few. It is a city where every moment is history, every stone a story, and every shadow a potential revelation. And as we continue this journey, the question becomes unavoidable. What does the future hold for Jerusalem? How will this city, so small yet so powerful, continue to shape the course of nations, faiths, and civilizations? And what hidden forces, buried deep beneath its layers, remain yet to be discovered? Forces that may yet alter the path of humanity itself. As we bring this incredible journey through Jerusalem to this moment, let us pause and reflect on what we have witnessed. From its earliest foundations at the sacred springs nearly 5,000 years ago, to the rise and fall of empires, the battles for its gates, the spiritual awakenings, and the unbroken thread of faith that has pulsed through its streets, Jerusalem has proven to be far more than a city. It is a living testament, a beacon of hope, a crucible of humanity, and a sacred meeting place of the divine and the earthly. Its stones have felt the footsteps of kings and prophets. Its walls have seen the tears of countless souls, and its sacred sites have carried prayers that echo across generations. We have seen how this city has shaped the world, how faith has inspired revolutions, how belief has influenced empires, and how the whispers of history continue to guide the hearts and minds of billions. Jerusalem stands as a reminder that God's hand moves through time and space, that His plans are woven into the fabric of our existence, and that His word endures beyond walls, beyond wars, beyond human understanding. And now, dear viewers, this message is no longer just a story. It is an invitation. I urge you to take what you have experienced today and make it personal. Write your personal confession in the comments below. Share your testimony. Speak openly about what God has done in your life, and let your voice be part of this living story. Every story shared here, every heart touched, becomes a ripple that extends God's blessing far beyond what we can see. I also challenge you, yes you, to share this video with at least 10 people, or even more if you feel called. Every share is not just content being sent across devices. It is God's teaching, His word, moving into hearts, transforming lives, and awakening souls. Imagine the countless people whose lives could be changed because of the act of sharing this truth. Imagine the prayers, the hope, the restoration, and the faith that can blossom because one person chose to pass it forward. This is urgent. This is holy responsibility. The story of Jerusalem is a story of faith, endurance, and divine purpose. And now, it is your moment to be part of it. Do not wait. Write, share, testify. Extend God's blessing to the world. Let His word reach souls that are yearning, hearts that are broken, and spirits that are searching. When you act, you become a vessel of transformation, a witness to the enduring power of God's plan, and a light in the lives of countless others. Remember, Jerusalem has shaped history, and now, together, we have the opportunity to shape the present and future by spreading His word. Let this message not remain within these walls. Let it move, let it grow, and let it change the world, one soul at a time.